Good evening. I hope you're all doing well. I'm Jim Anaya, Dean of the University of Colorado Law School. Thank you for joining us for a lecture and discussion in this special installment during Black History Month of the Race and the Law series. This evening's event features Tyrone Glover, a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer at Kilmer, Lane, and Newman, and a 2009 graduate of the law school. His presentation is titled Criminalizing Race, a Practitioner's Perspective on Policing and Mass Incarceration. I'd like to start off by recognizing that the University of Colorado is located on land within the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people's traditional territories. And I further acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We're pleased to partner for this event with the Sam Carey Bar Association and the law school's Black Law Students Association, also known as BALSA. Thank you to BALSA leaders Clement Assant and Van Michael Moore, both 2Ls, who will be moderating the Q&A session. The Race and the Law lecture series is part of Colorado Law's anti-racism and representation initiative. An overarching goal of the initiative is to enhance opportunities for learning and reflecting on racism and its effects and what each of us can do to defeat it as lawyers or future lawyers and citizens. We're pursuing this goal in part through this lecture series. Other overarching goals of the initiative are to expand the law school's role as a catalyst for direct action to combat racism and its manifestations around us, and to enhance the representation and inclusion of people of color and others from marginalized groups within our law school and the legal profession. If you're interested in learning more about the initiative and our progress with it, I encourage you to visit our website at colorado.edu/law. Before I introduce our speaker, a few items to note. Your screen name should be listed as first and last name. If it isn't, please update your profile and video settings. Your first and last name allow us to identify you so that you can receive CLE credit and your CLE affidavit. You're invited to introduce yourself using the chat function by typing your full name and whatever other information you want to provide. This is an interactive session. You can ask questions during the presentation using the chat function. Tyrone will respond to questions following the presentation. After the Q&A, you'll be randomly assigned to groups to discuss the topics outlined in your program, which you can find at cu.law/program. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tyrone Glover, who is an accomplished trial lawyer. Mr. Glover's legal career began at the Colorado Public Defender's Office, where he defended individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. Since leaving the Public Defender's Office, Mr. Glover has worked in private practice, representing clients in civil rights, criminal defense, and employment matters. He's tried over 40 jury trials throughout the state. A leader among his peers, he is the 2021-22 Denver Bar Association president. And at the upcoming 40th Annual Law Alumni Awards, the law school will honor and celebrate Tyrone with the Distinguished Achievement Small Firm Practitioner Award. You can find out more about Tyrone's impressive background in the program. I'm now delighted to turn the program over to Tyrone Glover.
Thank you so much, Dean Anaya. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me out. Hoping to have a really nice open conversation here. I have a lot to cover, so I think I'm just going to jump right in. So I'll go ahead and get started. All right, so the title of my presentation is Criminalizing Race, a Practitioner's Perspective on Policing and Mass Incarceration. These are two areas that I've intersected with in my practice, first as a public defender and now in doing criminal defense and civil rights work. I think, today's lecture is really significant for a number of reasons. This is the first Black Heritage Month coming after the social justice summer of 2020, or the George Floyd protests, or as I think people are calling it these days, the Great Awakening, right? This idea that over the summer, when we were all, so focused on the issues around us and being, I think, really introspective, due in large part due to the pandemic, there was just a overall increase in our community consciousness around issues of race and a real appetite and energy behind changing things. We're in the last week of Black History Month. And so, what I want to focus on is not so much the problem, right? I feel like, so much of last summer and so much of the lead up was focused on, people getting up to speed on the inequities, on the inequalities, on, the disproportionate numbers of African Americans, of Black folks in prison, of the school to prison pipeline. We're going to talk about that stuff. But I think the question that I am getting more often these days is, what next? What do we do next? From your perspective as someone in the trenches, on the ground, who sort of sees these things day in and day out, what can we do? What's being done? And I think that probably the most interesting thing, and the thing that I'm probably getting asked the most as of recent, is how do we keep the momentum going, right? How is this just not, this sort of groundswell that then sort of dies down and we're back to business as usual? And my response to people is, I think we need to really understand what we're dealing with. Understand that this isn't just a matter of, changing hearts and minds, which is good. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not just as simple as, learning to love one another and getting the hate out of your heart, right? These are systems which over centuries have manifested themselves time and time again. And they're oftentimes tied to what would appear to be race neutral motivations, but they're justified, again, by race. So I think really understanding the problem and understanding where it is rooted helps us best able keep it in the national consciousness and helps us better able to address it. So I want to kind of step back, and this was a bit of my great awakening and really sort of a benchmark in my life when I decided, I think, to dedicate myself to using the law as a way to try to affect change. It was 2006, my 1L year at CU Law School. Hewitt Covell, who I believe is here, and I were actually invited to take a tour of the city and county building, which back then did both criminal and civil matters in Denver. Chief Justice Larry Naves was going to give us a tour of all the courtrooms and basically the court system. I'd only been in maybe a couple of courts leading up to this, so I was really excited. We went down, and I remember Judge Naves showing us some of the different courtrooms, introducing us to court staff. But the thing that really stuck out to me on that day was when we went all the way up to the 5th floor, which is where they kept the folks who were waiting, who were incarcerated and waiting for their court. I remember it being a very small area, really low ceilings, and people were just packed in there. We barely could even squeeze in, and I remember being huddled over in the corner with Hewitt and Judge Naves. And I remember there was, to my left, just this little window. I didn't even realize that there was a room there. But I looked over to my left, over my shoulder, and there was, a young Black man, who could have been, one of my relatives, my brother, one of my cousins, literally there, just, inches away from my face. But He was in custody, he was incarcerated, he was in bondage. He wasn't going anywhere, right? And neither was anyone in this little holding pen. And I looked at them and I saw everyone packed to the gills, and I could not help but be struck by the inhumanity of it. And it reminded me of images I had seen in history books growing up and stuff that I had read about. And that's when I realized that, this was bigger than, this was bigger than just sort of changing your frame of mind. This was a system at play. And only something systematic and institutional could produce the types of results that I saw that day in that small holding pen, and continue to see in the criminal justice system and in policing. So let's talk a little bit about systematic racism, right? Oftentimes it starts from a place that's very race neutral, right? And the motivations are, economic. I would say for, the first probably 100 or 200 years, most of the motivations were economic, but they've also since manifested in ways that are political and social. And oftentimes it's race and a racial inferiority sort of narrative that comes in later to justify some of these, economic and political and social institutions. And so, the original sin for, this country and for the world really, as it relates to race, was slavery. And so I think you have to go back and, the first slaves, I think the first one touched down in 1619, but there was a real, I would say, a narrative around how to control and how to really handle Black folks that I think came about in 1712 when a gentleman who was a slaver in the West Indies named Willie Lynch came to Virginia and gave a speech to a bunch of owners of enslaved persons. This infamous Willie Lynch speech, endeavored to solve some of the problems that these slavers were having with their slaves. There were uprisings, enslaved people were running away, crops were being left untended, and they were taking too long to maximize profits. And there were mass hangings. That was oftentimes the way to deal with these issues. But he, quote, said that we were losing valuable stock by doing it that way. So he had a system that, would control and ultimately, endeavor to make the American slavery system more efficient, right, and more profitable. Sow seeds of fear, distrust, and envy in the populations to concentrate on future generations. But the biggest one, which I think manifests itself over and over again in the criminal justice system and in civil rights, is to try to break the meanest, and these are his words, men in front of the women. And there's just, I didn't put them in there because I think the quotes are so shocking. But, he's talking about tar and feathering, burning men alive, stretching them between, two horses, just essentially brutalizing Black men so much in front of Black women and others that they will raise their offspring to be mentally weak, dependent, but physically strong. So it really comes back to this idea of almost psychological power and control to keep this population of people who are very economically beneficial to this system, which was the driving force behind the American economy at the time. And this, which you will see over time, is that this brutalization and disregard for Black men and their humanity manifests itself over and over again through our various systems, and specifically the criminal justice system. So then we get to Reconstruction, right? And so what happens when all of these, African slaves are suddenly free, and you have this this huge economy that suddenly doesn't have any free labor, right? This is when we first start to see the weaponization of the criminal justice system, right? If you've seen the movie 13th, it's about the exception in the 13th Amendment, where you can force someone into unpaid labor as punishment, right? And so that's when we have, now the chain gangs, prison leasing, all of these other things. So we had black codes, that is sort of the umbrella term for all of these different methods of control, criminalization of minor offenses, convict leasing, chain gangs. This also served to disenfranchise and disempower. They didn't have the same abilities to negotiate labor contracts. This disenfranchised the black vote, and it expanded on sort of what the early slave catchers did, right? When you had people under your power and control on the plantation, you really only needed a force to go out and get the enslaved people that were running away. But once everyone was free, there were only so many that could be held in the prison. And so you now started to have police forces that needed to grow and expand in order to keep these Southern populations under control. The next major, what I would argue benchmark really is Jim Crow and the Great Migration. As Black folks started to try and assert their rights, and under the Constitution, we started to have a bit of pushback against segregation and the brutalities that were happening in the South. There was a much more concerted effort under the Jim Crow era in the South via lynchings, the Ku Klux Klan, all of these other various means of power and control to try to subdue Black folks. This resulted in the Great Migration, where over 1 million Black people from the Southern United States left and went for greener pastures. If you wonder why you do have large pockets of Black Americans in places like Oakland and LA, New York, Detroit, Chicago, and even you can see Colorado and Denver is sort of right there on that path. It's because of this migration for more opportunities in northern and western cities. But those even came with a whole host of problems, which you'll notice is, Great Migration 1916, and look at what the most popular movie in the country, I believe it was Woodrow Wilson, who maybe had a screening even at the White House and said that, it was, I forget the exact quote, but he was very impressed with the movie. This birth of a nation, this glamorization of the Ku Klux Klan, and this narrative that would go nationwide about, Black criminality. And it was this sort of odd circular thing where, Black folks were put into bondage and criminalized in the South as a means to keep them in bondage and working. But then that played into this narrative in the North where, Black people were criminals, right? They weren't criminals because they were committing crimes, right? They were criminals because they were criminalized to keep an old Southern economic institution going. So you still had segregations and lynchings going on primarily in the South. That stuff was also going on in the North. But then you also had, over-policing, arrests. You had disproportionate incarceration. Some of the over-policing is really the beginnings of what we've seen, manifest, even recently in northern cities. And one of the big hallmarks was this no protection from the brutality of white mobs, right? And I would argue that even much of what we see with things like qualified immunity and failing to hold police accountable is an outgrowth of the lack of protection that Black Americans had from white mobs and white brutality. On the left here we have a scene from the Tulsa massacre, which happened in 1921. A budding economic area in Tulsa was completely leveled by a white mob, and police participated in it. Up at the top is to the right, that's 1898. That was a coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, where, similarly, a white mob came in unchecked and completely leveled a black town and, installed their own, government. And, you can read about it, but there was a lot of white supremacist propaganda and a real groundswell there leading up to this. And then, of course, bottom right, we have Emmett Till, who was brutalized, and until recent, has not gotten, much justice. But, there was some level of accountability. And then we have, I think, what we're most familiar with, in recent times is the law and order era and the war on crime or the war on drugs, right? We credit it with starting with the Nixon era. We were at a bit of a, there was a less of a flag, I would say, to rally around with the Vietnam War coming to a close. And we were entering an era, of people wanting to see, for whatever reason, a little more, law and order and a return to some more traditional values, right? And so we had then, the war on crime and the war on drugs. Here is a quote from Mr. John, I always butcher his name, Ehrlichman, who was in the Nixon cabinet and actually, I think, did some time in Watergate, saying essentially, that, the way to get control of the dissenters is to criminalize the things that they are associated with and disrupt these communities. This quote is a bit controversial, and I tend to agree that it maybe wasn't as straightforward as that. I think that there were absolutely those motivations, but I also think when there were, certain political wins that, were and demonstrated a path to power by adopting certain stances, politicians were more than happy, both, on the right and on the left, to all sort of buy into this, let's get, tough on crime, let's get tough on these communities, instead of seeing the manifestations of, rampant drug use as a symptom of something that needs to be addressed. Let's almost, let's take them on in a more sort of battalion-like fashion. And so, the political climate of that time gave rise to what I see as the law and order era, right? We saw mandatory minimums for drug offenses, 20 years, essentially, in some countries is a life sentence for drugs. This was when the 101 ratio to crack cocaine manifested itself. And just to sort of give some perspective on that, you would have to have 1,000 grams of cocaine in order to be looking at a 10-year mandatory minimum, under the federal system. You would have to have 10 grams of crack to be looking at the same thing. This gave rise to the 1994 crime bill, which got rid of a lot of rehabilitative things that were happening in our penitentiaries, expanded the death penalty, eliminated higher education, solidified the 3 strikes laws. And then we started to see, especially in the 80s, stop and frisk and broken window policing, this sort of reduced civil right, reduced Fourth Amendment type policing. And then the real ramp up to this almost, we had the patrols, right, that were essentially injected with rocket fuel during Reconstruction, but this almost patrol-like type of policing, which started to really take form in a more modern sense in the 80s, with, officers, 70% of which live outside of the urban areas they're policing, coming in with this, military grade, equipment, and almost occupying these areas, as opposed to, I think, policing them in a more, public peacekeeping function. And then, we started to see more police in schools, right? Getting tough on crime was, getting school resource officers in there who were law enforcement officers, who were not necessarily, counselors or social workers. And then, so now we start to see the beginnings of the school to prison pipeline. So now that, that takes us into, what I see as the modern era. And we're seeing some shifts and some changes in the way that we're thinking about these issues. And I would argue that, we're moving away from the way that systematic racism has manifested itself over and over again. We're less inclined to have this knee-jerk reaction of, if there's something that is problematic in our communities, the best way to deal with it is to criminalize it, right? Because all that it means when you criminalize something, it doesn't necessarily make it better. It just means that, you implement a harsher punishment. You take away more people's more liberty from folks. And it's a harken back to this brutality as a means to address problems in the Black community, in the same vein that Willie Lynch spoke about back in slavery. So I think it's really informative to really understand that the old ways that we sought to deal with problems vis-a-vis the criminal justice system, are ways that historically have manifested themselves, and we've tried and have just failed. So why are we in this, I guess, this new era, right? I would argue that, it's been harder to be desensitized to, these law and order policies. We can't and sort of be apathetic about them when we're confronted with this brutality on such a vivid and ubiquitous level, right? Where, we have a front seat to the brutality against Black Americans because of technology, because of body cams, because of cell phone videos. It's hard to look away when something is happening in Ferguson or Sacramento or Denver or New York, right, can be put in and thrust into the national consciousness by just an upload to YouTube. We've also seen finally the fallout from the recent decades of these law and order policies. We have, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And now, we're looking at these statistics and seeing just how disproportionate these policies have been and how they've affected Black Americans. And we've even seen how it's bled over into the majority population with the opioid epidemic, right? We're not having a war on the opioid epidemic. And I think that we've realized pretty quickly that we were woefully unable to address the challenges of that with law and order policing type tactics and punishment tactics. So I think that even held up a bit of a lens to the way that we've handled these things in the past. And then there's the just increased collective consciousness that have been brought up about by recent events. There's always been people working hard in these areas, but I think that their work has gotten momentum as of recent because of, just everything being in the public psyche. So that pretty kind of brings me to the what. What is going on and what is like the work that we need to, I think, be committed to, and what's the stuff that I'm seeing on the ground and in the trenches that's making a difference. And I would hope that sort of this historical perspective that I've just given helps us better understand the need to continue the good work that we're doing. And to the extent that things that maybe appear to be race neutral on their face rear their head, or we maybe potentially slide into an era that has some makings of some of these previous historical eras, you're able to issue spot them a little bit better. Because I think, history is a great teacher. And if you think that we just sort of came upon some of these results, even in the last couple of decades, I would submit that that's wrong. This has been an outgrowth from, this country's original sin. So the school to prison pipeline is a huge one. Youth of color are suspended and expelled and criminalized at a much higher rate. There's a likelihood of 41% that they will enter adult prison by the time they're 25 if they intersect with the criminal justice system while they're in school. And, you know, we have 14 million students in schools with police, but not counselors, not nurses, not psychologists or social workers. You know, when I was a juvenile public defender, you know, even I think of the stuff that I got in trouble, you know, doing, right? And got maybe, you know, sent to detention or, you know, at worst suspended. You know, there are kids now who are being arrested and being sent to, you know, juvenile detention centers for acting out in class, for getting in like a little schoolyard scrap, right? And they're being charged with things like interference with a public institution, which is basically just being disruptive and unruly in school. And now, you know, they're intersected with the criminal justice system. They're in the system, and that, you know, increases their likelihood of, you know, having a record or intersecting with the system again when they're an adult. You know, if somebody comes in front of you, you know, as an adult, oftentimes it's their record that determines how well they're treated. And a DA will look at, you know, did they get in trouble when they were a juvenile, and deciding how to deal with the case. And so if you have a population of young people who are already being criminalized, they're starting at a deficit when they're, you know, potentially going to intersect with the adult system. So, you know, that is, you know, one thing I think that happened recently was last summer, Denver public schools got rid of all of their DPD, school resource officers. I would submit that that is a good step in addressing the school to prison pipeline, but we need to be doing more. And while I think a lot of people are well-meaning in the juvenile system, we can't lose sight of, you know, yes, we can give people resources from that system, but there is a detrimental effect to them being in that. So I think we should, you know, implement measures to keep them out of the system, as opposed to just taking it for granted that, you know, it's maybe a good thing that they're in it in the first place. Militarized policing, right? This is an extension of the patrol effect, right? You know, having these, you know, and this is in Denver, you know, having these military grade, you know, military type weapons, you know, driving, you know, down our streets, you know, often driven by people who are coming from outside of the community, right? And, you know, this is sort of, when I hear people say, you know, defund the police, the second bullet point is, you know, that is sort of the complaint that I'm hearing, is that resources are going to, you know, this style of policing, this almost occupation style of policing, and not to community resources, you know, not to, you know, mental health resources, economic resources, you know, school resources, right? They're going towards this more militarized approach. I remember, you know, the gang unit in Denver, you know, it was this sort of like hyper sort of, you know, hyped up type of unit that was going out there and you know, taking down, you know, gang violence, you know, especially during the early 90s, you know, when a lot of, you know, those JLWOP cases, the juvenile life without parole cases that we're now dealing with, which were deemed to be unconstitutional, many of those prosecutions happened during, you know, what is a militarized era. My understanding is that, you know, the way that these gang units recently have been, you know, they've been reconstituted, and we're seeing, you know, less, you know, a preference for more specialty courts, right? I think there's a specialty court in Denver right now to deal with gun violence. There's one to deal with drugs, as opposed to, you know, forming more militarized units, right? So we're starting to see that manifest, and I think that that's good. You know, mandatory minimums and habitual counts. I remember being in front of a federal court judge and struggling to explain to him why my client, who was getting sentenced on a federal matter, was currently doing a 96-year sentence, you know, in state court. You know, this is an outgrowth from, you know, a mandatory minimum, right, where you can essentially do a virtual life sentence for doing, you know, crimes that otherwise on their own would not warrant a life sentence. You know, even sometimes nonviolent crimes, or crimes that are violent but don't result in anyone dying, yet you are, you know, serving a life sentence yourself. And so there are definitely trends right now. You know, the drug laws have been on consistent scrutiny. Since I've been practicing, I've watched, a mandatory minimum at the state level for any sale of any controlled substance go from being 10 years to being probation eligible to possession of a Schedule I controlled substance being a misdemeanor. We need to just continue to evaluate these sorts of things. And, I think that, that is the continuing trend, and, one that as a practitioner gives me a lot to work with. And just giving more discretion, just getting away from mandatory minimums. And judges, even where there are mandatory minimums, are finding creative ways to interpret the law. And that's another thing I'll talk about in a little bit is, the judiciary is actually standing up and saying, enough is enough. Our hands are not completely tied. We can find creative ways to interpret some of these statutes to come with a more just outcome. The erosion of constitutional rights, there's some real pushback here. This is a picture of Breonna Taylor, who was, the victim of a no-knock warrant. This idea that you can just kick down someone's door completely unannounced. And, if they exercise their right to self-defense, you can fire back. There's a lot of pushback about that. And there are jurisdictions, I think, even in Colorado, this legislative session, there may be some stuff coming down the pipe to deal with no-knock warrants. We've already seen significant reforms around chokeholds and excessive force. So it's a reverse of this idea that we need to brutalize, Black people and specifically Black men to, have some sort of meaning in keeping the peace in those communities. And other more invasive things like, ketamine and other sedatives, and the disproportionate minority contacts as well. The finding, a few years ago of the stop and frisk policies being unconstitutional. And I think that has actually spawned a number of precincts and a number of departments and states to look at these disproportionate minority contacts. And there's actually, I think, a number of things in the works, even locally, to try to hold, folks accountable to sort of make a dent in that as well. Cash bail is a huge one, and this is one that I've even seen activism on, not activism, but, judges pushing back on at the state level, and, years ago, and now it's really starting to get momentum. We have these pretrial assessment tools, which I think some have come under scrutiny, but, they're trying to work towards being more objective. And in my opinion, it's better than cash bail. There's no reason why anyone should have to stay in prison because they can't pay. And even a realization through COVID, we've been, the jails are not at near the capacity as they used to be. And I think we're realizing there's not as much utility. There isn't really any utility to keeping people incarcerated awaiting trial if we have ways to ensure that they're going to show up. And so I think there's been some reevaluations of that as well. And, representing people who are on bond, I don't think there has been, much difference other than, something related to COVID or the pandemic as far as FTAs, which are failures to appear. And then there's even a real push from, even the business community and folks you wouldn't necessarily think are wading into this space around their hiring practices and trying, to make sure that people are ready when they are incarcerated and they come out to reintegrate to the world. Most people are not going to be doing a life sentence. And the way that we keep them from, going through this revolving door of the criminal justice system is we make sure that they can have, economically viable lives and get out and reintegrate to the community in a meaningful way. So there's a real push I've seen from the business community and others for fair hiring practices, banning the box, other restorative justice efforts, and even in-prison training and education. And then, there is kind of the hallmark of, Colorado. We had SB 2217, which was designed for more police integrity and accountability. There are now judges, federal and state, who are pushing back against things like qualified immunity, which I feel like is this sort of outgrowth of the protection of the mob mentality of giving an unreasonable amount of protection to bad actors. There's now pushback and even buy-in from law enforcement agencies around things like qualified immunity, which essentially is, you do not have immunity if you, if you brutalize, somebody or an unarmed Black person. At the end of the day, if someone comes after your department or you, and you can be sued, you cannot say that you are, immune to any sort of liability. So, holding police accountable to the same standards that the rest of us are held to is an idea that I think is now gaining momentum, and it passed overwhelmingly in Colorado. Heightened standards for use of force, instead of it just being objectively reasonable, we're now holding people to the standard that they need to use necessary and appropriate force. And we're sort of now on, body worn camera phase 2, right? I think that it was a good first move to adopt body worn cameras, and it's definitely, I think, been helpful overall to really understanding what's going on within law enforcement departments. And getting more transparency, but there's problems with body worn cameras, not really having sufficient sanctions if the cameras are tampered with or malfunction, right? There's also some bias that has recently been, I think, fleshed out from the way that, the cameras even film certain interactions, but we are still like in a phase where, I believe, and what I've seen in my practice, we're assessing this, and we haven't necessarily given up on this technology, but we also haven't become complacent in saying that this is kind of the end all be all. And so, at the end of the day, I think there's going to be some reforms around body worn cameras, and that, hopefully will be a good tool in the future. So that's really, from my perspective, much of what I've seen on the ground as a practitioner. These are the things that are coming down the pipe, year after year, that make my job, as a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer, it helps, it makes my job easier. I'm able to be, I think, more effective in standing up for the rights of marginalized communities and getting justice for my clients. And I just hope that we don't, change course. I think the reforms that I'm seeing are all in the right direction. And more importantly, they're rooted in a different kind of history than the lead up. And so hopefully the historical piece of it really helps to sort of illustrate that and make you feel like we're in a different place and we don't want to go back to where we were. So thank you very much. And I think that's, we'll be at our Q&A at this point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tyrone, for such an insightful presentation. It's already sparked some people in the chat, a couple questions. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. So folks, feel free to submit using the chat function any questions that you have. We can start off with this question from Shauna. Can you speak on Denver sending social workers instead of police to 911 calls? And apparently that was enacted this past year.
Yeah, and I just saw something recently. I forget if it was in the Post or the Sun. I believe it's called the STAR program. And I don't know if they just send only social workers. My understanding of the program is that a social worker accompanies a more traditional law enforcement officer, or at least someone that is kind of has that quasi function. And the headline that I saw as of recent was that none of those contacts that had gone through that program had resulted in anyone being arrested, right? I think that that's a great approach that I support. Having people in there that have the training around mental health, right? That have the training in counseling around conflict, resolution versus conflict escalation, which happens sometimes, I think is the right approach. I remember there was one time I was out in front of the Denver courthouse, and I was with, one of my clients, and there was some, I think, confusion about him having a warrant. And the officer that was talking to him and was talking to me was being very respectful and was just sort of inquisitive and wanting to know what happened. And right in the middle of this, another officer ran up and he was yelling and he was all kinds of hot-headed, and you just saw the whole thing start to escalate. Luckily we got it de-escalated, but I feel like that's what oftentimes happens is, a situation like that escalates and no one with any training is there to sort of get control of the situation. They sort of step back. They're more differential. They don't want to cross the line of the officer who's maybe getting a little bit hot-headed. And then, it leads to an escalated situation, which we've seen can lead to the death of an unarmed Black person. So having someone there who can say like, whoa, hold on a second, this person's having having this type of episode, or, we should talk to them about this specific thing and sort of get the situation under control. I'm all for, and I think that the preliminary results is that it's been good.
Yeah, thank you, Tyrone, for sharing that. We have one more question, another question from Mario, and he asks, has anyone done any study on the cost of militarized items like the SWAT tanks that you use in a picture versus the cost of community resource officers?
Yeah, I don't know if they've done like a cost comparison. I know that there are, incentive programs that, are out there to where some of this old or retired military equipment can be made available. So I think, to law enforcement. So I think that, my understanding is that the path, right, to really understanding the costs, right, because there's subsidies, is a little bit murky. And I think especially with so much of these reforms in these efforts being new, I think the projections say that they will be more cost effective in the long run, but I don't think that there is anything, there's not a concrete comparison on the books, because I think a lot of these reform efforts are pretty new.
All right. The next question comes from Chad. It's a long one. Do we as a society need to provide as many resources to educating the non-impacted but highly influential dominant groups that have great control for changing and enforcing laws and policing? And just as some context, he says, I'm thinking the greater structures of society that allow racism to continue in policing and justice, meaning addressing our caste systems to change the empathy factor.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's greater, right? I think that, we need to, fight this battle really on all fronts, right? We need to make sure that we're addressing the marginalized communities in a way that's more holistic, right? We need to see their struggles as a symptom of voids that have been left in the communities by, centuries of bad policies and systems and institutions. But in the same vein, the only way that we're going to get real buy-in and real lasting change and a real sustainable elevated consciousness is if we are, educating the folks in power. I think that's sort of what he's asking is making sure that we really have buy-in from top to bottom. And I think that we're seeing that, right? It's not like little, it's not these small Black-owned businesses that are stepping up. It's like, the Amazons and the eBays and the Facebook. It's like all of these, it's the biggest companies that we've known to man that we've ever known in history that are oftentimes riding into these battles and wanting to see change. But, where I think there may be struggle is folks wanting to see change, but not knowing what to do, and maybe stumbling into some bad policies, or I guess at worst, stuff that just doesn't move the needle because they don't know the history and they aren't educated. So yeah, no, I agree that there needs to be, top to bottom efforts, but I don't think we should sacrifice one over the other.
Yeah, Thank you again, Tyrone. And our next question comes from Ken, and they make a general observation of a fact that they found, and then have a question afterwards. And says they researched the percentage of Black male inmates in Colorado percentage-wise. There's less than many other states. There's less than there are in many other states, but the length of sentence is longer than that of non-Black inmates. And have you, Tyrone, observed that as well?
Yeah, I think, what is it, the highest population, this used to be the statistic of Black Americans, of Black folks in Denver, outside of like Denver and Aurora, is in the Department of Corrections. Yeah, I think there's absolutely, the way that sentencing works, right? You're looking at either, your sentence is going to be lengthy if you are charged with something that carries a mandatory minimum, right? Or if you're charged with multiple counts of things that carry mandatory minimums. Oftentimes it's economic crimes. Until recently, it was drug crimes. And the difference between whether you get a prison sentence on something that that doesn't have a mandatory minimum or you don't is often because of your record. So then therein lies the school to prison pipeline, right? You pick up a juvie record, and then now you find yourself on something small in misdemeanor court as an adult. You're less likely to get like a deferred judgment or some sort of offer that allows you to erase that from your record because you've already been in this pipeline. And then once you have a misdemeanor something or other, then it's harder for you to, get talked down from a felony, right? So it just kind of all builds and builds and builds. And then, the worse your record, the longer a sentence you're looking at. So yeah, no, I absolutely believe that's a factor.
Okay, this next one comes from Jeff, and he's wondering, the decision of the grand jury not to indict the officers involved in the death of Daniel Prude in Rochester, New York, is a step backwards. The non-disclosure of this incident for 6 months shows that things are not changing fast enough to prevent injustice. Should there be a re-examination of the grand jury system to allow for greater transparency?
I think so, especially because the adage is a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, right? And doing cases, I handle a number of cases where there's a grand jury, and they seem to have no issue being able to get indictments when it's a non-officer. But as soon as it's an officer, it seems like they can't indict them on the highest counts, or if at all. Right? It's the prosecutor that gets to put on the case to the grand jury. And so, to the extent that there is, some sort of, loyalty to the officers that they have to depend on, especially in their district, to make their cases. I think there needs to be more transparency about, if not the deliberations, at least the type of evidence that the prosecutors are putting forth during these grand jury proceedings. And what charges were they asking for at the outset? Like, how are these decisions being made? Holding them accountable and having more transparency. I think, we're in a bit of a transparency crisis in our profession as it is, and I definitely think that more transparency would at least be good for the public's knowledge. Whether that will change anything, I don't know, but it definitely will give us more mechanisms to hold folks accountable.
So so our next question comes from Daniel, and the question is, has the privatization of prisons and security played a role in criminalizing race?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, it was something that I probably meant to talk about, and if I didn't, I apologize. But no, I absolutely think that the privatization of prisons, that was a big piece of like the Great Migration, right? This sort of expansion of Black folks into all of these different areas in the country where they hadn't been, created an opportunity to expand the prison industrial complex, right? And with that, there was, economic opportunity, and deals made, and that's when I think you saw like the first phase of the expansion of the private prison system, which then I think got a bit of a rocket fuel injection during the war on crime. So yeah, no, I absolutely think that it had a part to play. My understanding is, there's, starting to be some step backs. I don't know how much of a dent in Colorado the removal of the private prisons is going to make. I think it definitely in places like California, where that private prison industrial complex is just huge. I think there's even publicly traded companies that own some of them. It can make a bigger dent, but it certainly has been an outgrowth of this system. I think probably dating back to the Jim Crow and migration era.
All right, next question is from Jude. Do you have thoughts on use and misuse of restraint chairs in jails?
Yes, I mean, I think that they are oftentimes misused, right? And it's interesting, because we've had, my firm has had cases of restraint chair misuse, and they tend to come from, I think, certain jurisdictions. People they're quicker to put people in certain jails into the restraint chairs and to utilize them, whereas others, you see like the sort of more controlling, like smocks and other things, but then those jails tend to have issues with other types of brutality. Yeah, I don't like the restraint chairs, but I think that just getting rid of the restraint chair itself is not enough to address the problem. It goes back to the training of the folks working, in these facilities, because it's not as though, it's like the problem with like the tasers, right? There's, plenty of precincts now, there's less shootings, right? But they're tasing people to death, right? And if we get rid of the restraint chairs, then sort of what's the next thing that's going to become problematic? If we aren't changing, the actual training and the mindset and the cultures within these institutions, then it doesn't matter whether it's a suicide smock or a restraint chair or a taser, right? They're going to find ways to sort of affect their brutality, which is kind of the history lesson, right? The methodology has changed over decades and over centuries, but because the culture and the system and the institutions hasn't, we're still seeing the same results.
Yeah, and our last question today comes from Steve, and the question is, can you speak to what deferred judgment is? Does it mean that once you complete your agreements, then your record is cleared or sealed?
Right. So a deferred judgment means if someone goes, let's say that you get charged with a crime and I'm your lawyer, and the DA can make a bunch of different offers. One of the offers that they make could be to defer your charge. So you would plead guilty, and this is how, the juvie magistrate in my courtroom when I was a juvenile public defender always described it. And that guilty plea goes up on the shelf. And if you complete a period of probation, then that guilty plea gets thrown in the trash, right? And they dismiss it. And you can go in and these days very expeditiously seal the case. But oftentimes that type of relief where you basically get, I wouldn't say it's a freebie, right? You still have to go through probation and all of this stuff, but you get the ability to not have a record is oftentimes reserved for very specific types of crimes, right? And only reserved for people who don't have a record. And so if you're showing up on, a crime that, more often or disproportionately affects a certain marginalized community, or you have some record from juvie, or you have like an early record in your 20s, right? You're not going to be given the opportunity, oftentimes by policy, not even vis-a-vis discretion, to have a DJ. And so then that just sort of starts you off on the wrong foot.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Glover, for your presentation tonight. I imagine your presentation has prompted a meaningful dialogue for the breakout groups that is about to occur here in a moment. But for everyone else, by the end of the week, you should receive an email with the link to the presentation and a survey to share feedback. And then for those call out attorneys who are on the call today, there will be a link provided to you as well for the CLE affidavit. So stay tuned for further information on that. But for now, we're going to transition into the breakout rooms. And then in those breakout rooms, about to end you get a 2-minute warning before it ends. And that one does that 2-minute warning is over, the session will be complete. So Mr. Glover, I just want to thank you so much. I know that for myself, speaking for my own personal perspective as a Black man, and, you being an alumni here as well, you bring such a unique perspective, and, we working in the field for a while now. So thank you, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks for having me, everyone.